that first chapter when you were just a little child. I was wondering, do you remember when you fell down the stairs there? Were you old enough to recall that?
Oh yeah, that was quite a traumatic thing. And yes, I remember the pain in my head and in my lower back. And I remember, what that chapter says, that I I was becoming too weak to even stand. And I remember the whole thing collapsing. And yeah.
Yeah. What about your life before polio? Do you remember like and I know you were like I think 5 years old when all this happened,
Mhm.
but do you remember when you were well enough to able to walk and run, things like that?
Yeah, well, I don't recall actually running, but I'm sure I did. And walking, as I remember when I was like 3, before breakfast one morning, I disappeared, and my parents were in a panic. And dad was farming and driving a school bus, and he was just ready to call the school district and say, I can't drive the bus this morning. Our little girl is lost. We got to find her somewhere in the woods. And I suddenly appeared walking up the driveway. And I'd been just out exploring in the woods. And my parents said, where were you? You were lost. And I said, I wasn't lost. I knew where I was.
Well, that adventurous spirit that has served you well for over the years. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. Um, did did your family or did you all have any inclination of how you contracted the polio? Yeah, just curious.
No, it was during a time when people were just, it was an epidemic year and an epidemic time. Um, my cousin just a quarter mile up in the next farmhouse, she got it. Um, my younger brother got a touch of it. Even my dad got a touch.
Mm,
But no, it was just, it's kind of like the flu virus. Where do you get it?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think in maybe your autobiography, you mentioned there was a Dr. Brown, I think, who you were taken to, and he did some test to determine that you had polio. Maybe you can describe what they had to do to figure out if you had polio.
Yeah, well, the first thing they did when a patient like that came, uh, you know, um, bulbar polio, which is one of the polios I had, one of the two I had, um, attacks the brain stem and also the lining around the brain. And so it gives you a terrible, terrible low headache right there. Well, that is also what encephalitis does. It gives that same kind of pain in that area. So they had to discover whether it was encephalitis or polio. And polio was, of course, one of the things they thought about because of the epidemic going on right then. So yeah, I remember the tests with the pins and all that. So
Okay, yeah. They had to like cover you from you weren't able to see, and then they would test if you felt
yeah,
certain things, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay,
And so he determined it was polio.
yeah.
Yeah,
Now, you mentioned bulbar polio. There were different kinds of polio, to my understanding. W-
yeah.
What what did you have specifically?
Okay, there is so-called paralytic polio. That's the one that attacks the the message system to your to your voluntary muscles. like the muscles I'm using now to move my arms and what you use to move your leg, etc. So that's paralytic polio, um, it- that attacks the spinal column, things at the spinal column. I had all that and bulbar polio, that is the bulbus or the brain stem. And that's the area that controls the muscles around intestines and heart and diaphragm, all those things that are not voluntary, that just happen. And yeah, I had both of those.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Um, you mentioned there were others that you knew that got polio. Were there other children in your school that had it as well?
Yes, there was one boy about a year or two younger than me who never was able to walk, and his parents were very, very poor. And somehow, I don't know how, but they did not know about the Shriners Hospital um, until he was in, I think, junior high or high school. So he actually crawled around.
Mm.
He couldn't walk at all. And I can remember seeing him in the gym with a tennis ball by himself, throwing that tennis ball up at the basketball hoop to entertain himself. It was very sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Let me ask, you're in the story, it mentions your parents thinking, God, you can't do this to our little child. How did your parents deal with their own spiritual battles as you were going through, facing polio and going through everything that involved?
Well, they got to the point where they just said, "She is yours." And that was a true surrender. They did not um, take that back. And so as I was growing up, they they just continued to put me in God's hands and let God lead me and got out of the way, I guess you'd say. I wanted to do all these crazy things, and, and they didn't ever say no.
Amen. Well, thankful for that. So you understood they had come to that point when you were fairly young, or
Well, no, I didn't. I didn't realize until I was older, and mom told me that story. Um, I just kind of, as a child, you kind of just take things for granted. You don't think through those things. You don't understand how adults think.
right? Yeah, for sure. Um, you had to go through some physical therapy during this time. What types of things did that involve?
Yeah, when I was first recovering from polio, I can remember lying on my back on a table, and the therapist would kind of grab my feet and bring my legs, my knees, bend my knees up so that they were near my chest, and then he would tell me, push, push, think, push. And what he was trying, and then he would do, move the legs accordingly.
Mhm.
Uh, and what he was trying to do was to reestablish the connection between the brain and the muscle. Because I would think push, 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 and try to do it, and I couldn't because that connection wasn't there yet. But he was trying to build that brain muscle connection.
Right.
because by then, some of the muscle fibers, the secondary, that's the mm, uh, sprouts, which are not as strong as the original ones that you're born with. Some of them had grown, and so I had some muscle then, but it had to learn how to hear the brain.
Yeah, yeah. Now, was that Mr. Carper who?
Yeah, Mr. Carper.
Okay, and didn't he
Yeah.
call you a snake once?
Yeah. Yes. I was on the on a mat on the floor, and they wanted me to roll over, and I was too tired. I just, didn't want to. I was done for the day. And so I just kind of wiggled, and that's when he said, "You look like a snake that way." And that's when I said, "No, I'm not. Snakes don't have arms and legs."
And you said something about snake moves with all of
Yeah,
it.
so he said, "Well, how do they move then?" And I said, "With their all together."
That's great. That's great. Yeah, yeah.
And he remembered that clear, for what would that must have been 30 years. He remembered that. He just got such a kick out of it.
Now I know while you were in the hospital, you had your little red radio that you would listen
Yes.
to programs on. What were some of the? Do you remember some of the programs that you listened to?
Yeah, I do. Big John and Sparky.
Okay.
That was one kid's program. And uh mm, and I'd listen to, that's when they had Lone Ranger
Okay.
and different, Hopalong Cassidy
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Roy Rogers.
I think at one point you had to be in an iron lung. There's probably kids who don't know what that is. Maybe you can
Yeah,
describe what that was and then what the experience was of having been.
yeah. That was right when I was fighting the polio right at the beginning, and I couldn't move anything. And the polio had attacked my diaphragm, the thing that pumps your lungs. And so I was not able to breathe hardly. In fact, I was getting weaker and weaker. And so they put me in an iron lung. They did not have the kind of respirators we do now. They can't, they didn't have those that put something over your nose and blew air into you. So this iron lung is uh, a round thing, round, big enough to put a person in, and it's sealed. And they put a kind of an elastic thing around your neck, so just your head is sticking out. And then what they do is suction air out of it and then blow air back into it. And that way it made your body, you know, push in and pull out. So it breathed for you.
Wow. Wow. And do you remember being in there and like were you?
No, I don't. But I remember my older sister described it to me. Um, Mom wouldn't ever talk about it. And I can understand why. That would have been very, very, very traumatic for a parent,
Um,
mom or dad.
I figured that there's probably children who will um hear your story and just have some, I know, kind of rabbit trail type of questions as well about things like maybe what did you have favorite toys when you were a child? Any favorite hobbies, things like that?
Uh, my favorite thing to do was play outside. Um, and I was not much of a doll player. I had some dolls, but mom said I would line up the dolls I had and my two little brothers, and I would be teacher. And so we would have school. And
Right.
that was before I went to school, but I knew what it would was, what it was like. And so I enjoyed doing that. Later on, when I was 11 or 12, I had a uh, a dollhouse that I still have, and it's on display on top of the fridge in my kitchen with all the furniture and stuff. And I played with that some, but mostly I liked to be outdoors.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people might not know, but you live there on the same property, the farm there that
Yeah.
is described in the story, right?
Yes, that I live where I grew up. Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. And it's described as a farm. What kind of farm was it or is it?
Yeah, well, we had milk cows. Now, we did not sell the milk commercially, just enough for our family. And then uh, dad separated the milk into skim milk and cream,
Mm,
and he would sell the cream
okay.
and use that money to buy extra groceries. we He grew a big garden, so we had those vegetables, and so we had the cows, and then we had chickens also, and mom sold extra eggs for spending money for her that
Mm,
she needed for her little things,
right.
and then grew hay and that kind of thing. Yeah, just the old timey small farm way of doing things. Um, Eventually, dad had another job as well. He had a degree in forestry and botany, and so he, with the Soil Conservation Service, he was a farm advisor. He would help other farmers plan their farms.
Okay.
So yeah.
Interesting. Wow. Well, I don't have any too many more questions here. I did have a question about so when you were back home, I think there was some type of pedal car experiment.
Yeah.
Maybe you can describe what that was, what happened.
Yeah, that was a metal car, and those kinds of toys were popular then. Shaped like a car. Well, actually, this one was kind of shaped like sort of a fire engine, and you sat in it, and it had pedals that you pushed that made the wheels turn, and you had a steering wheel. Well, my legs were too weak to do that on gravel outside, so they had me ride it inside, and the idea was to strengthen my legs. However, too many bumps into furniture and too many scratches. Several of those later, they decided that having that was not such a good idea after all.
Right.
So then they put it outside, and my brothers played with it.
Okay, all right. Got passed on to them. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anything else you would think you want to share from this time period in your life when you were a childhood? Anything else memorable that?
Yeah, those days in the hospital. that is when I came to know that God was there for me and he was my father. My personal father, my earthly father, he could only do so much for me, but God, that father, he was watching me and he was caring for me.
Yeah.
And I I became very conscious, very aware of that.
Yeah. It reminds me that God often uses adversity in our life to draw us close to Him, to reveal Himself to
Yeah,
us. So that
yeah.
even being physically apart from your parents by necessity, there, how the Lord used that.
Yes, and times when like the time I knew I was dying
Yeah.
and just asked God to help me, and I knew He did.